Today we're going to talk about the decline of American manufacturing. Have you ever thought about which country's products you prefer to use? Even if you don't have a specific preference, there's probably at least one country's products you tend to avoid. Made in China. Yes, we're talking about Chinese-made products. Globally, there's a tendency to question the quality and safety of products made in China. This skepticism exists because, although these products often look good on the outside, their quality is frequently poor, and the manufacturing process or ingredients often violate safety standards. This perception is rooted in past experiences. However, nowadays, while domestic Chinese products might still have issues, their export goods have significantly improved to match the standards of other countries. It's no exaggeration to say that Chinese products have taken over the world. Since China's economic reforms, the country has spent about 30 years capitalizing on low labor costs to become the world's factory. According to recent analysis by the OECD in 2020, China was the world's leading producer, accounting for 35% of global manufacturing output. Additionally, China ranks first in the production of over 40% of the top 500 industrial products globally. The world relies on China's vast manufacturing capacity, cost efficiency, and extensive supply chain. And the world includes the United States as well. Despite the trade tensions between the US and China, the US remains China's largest export destination. The US government is so concerned about its dependence on China that it is actively working to reduce this reliance through what is known as decoupling from China. For instance, Foxconn, Apple's largest partner and the world's largest contract manufacturer, operates a factory in Zhengzhou, Henan Province, China. At one point, this factory was responsible for 60% of Apple's total production, making it the largest iPhone production base. Thus, it's fair to say that Apple's iPhones are products made by both China and the United States. In fact, when you buy an iPhone, you'll find this phrase on the back of the box. Designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. Apple's designers in California create the blueprint, and then hundreds of thousands of low-wage workers in Foxconn's Zhengzhou factory follow those blueprints to produce the phones. When Apple first released the iPhone in 2007, Nokia from Finland dominated the global mobile phone market. With 900 million users at that time, many were skeptical about the iPhone's success. However, in just 4 years, Nokia started losing ground to Apple, and the following year, it was overtaken by Samsung, eventually fading into obscurity. Today, Apple and Samsung are fiercely competing for the top spot in the global smartphone market, making Apple one of the most beloved companies worldwide. The Financial Times pointed out that one of the keys to Apple's success is its sophisticated Chinese supply chain. Over the past decade and a half, Apple has sent its product designers and manufacturing engineers to China to build this supply chain. Thanks to this Chinese supply chain, Apple not only reduced costs, but also easily secured a leading position in the global market. For example, if Hyundai Motors were to move all its factories to China, it could profit more from selling each car. Without the concept of labor unions, there would be no production disruptions, and the extra money could be invested in further research and development. This assumes the same quality level, of course. Despite the US-China trade disputes, Apple CEO Tim Cook visited China in March 2024, stating, "There is no more important supply chain to us in the world than China." He also promised more investments not just in supply chains, but also in research and development. But at this point, you might start to wonder, there was a time when the phrase "American-made is the best" was commonly heard, as American-made products were known for their exceptional quality. Yet today, while we still see American brands, very few products are actually manufactured in the United States. In the 20th century, the US was the symbol of mass production, not China. Especially in steel, where the US once outproduced all of Europe, including the Soviet Union. During World War II, the US was known as the arsenal of democracy. The country's manufacturing prowess played a significant role in securing victory in the war. However, at some point, American manufacturing began to decline. And today, the US is one of the countries most dependent on China's manufacturing supply chain. While the US remains the second largest manufacturing country globally, it has long lost its global dominance. Although it's still second, when you consider the scale of the US economy, it's a distant second. The manufacturing sectors that the US once dominated are now distributed among countries like China, South Korea, Japan, and Germany. Former President Trump frequently talked about reviving American manufacturing, and the Biden administration is now making massive investments to do just that. They are even implementing policies to bring back factories that had moved overseas. The U.S. is also inviting foreign manufacturing plants to its soil, with several South Korean conglomerates participating. For instance, Samsung is investing in a semiconductor plant in Texas. SK Hynix is building an AI memory package production base in Indiana. LG Energy Solution is establishing battery plants in Georgia, Arizona, and Ohio. And Hyundai is investing in electric vehicle plants in Georgia and Alabama. According to reports on the U.S. manufacturing promotion policies and global corporate trends, despite its importance, American manufacturing has been on a downward trajectory. The U.S. must regain its status as a manufacturing powerhouse, although this effort could expand into protectionism. The fact that the word regain is being used shows that there is a perception in the U.S. that its manufacturing sector has declined. It's not that American technology has deteriorated, so how did American manufacturing decline? To the point where it is now described as in a state of collapse. Let's take a closer look at the history of American manufacturing. In October 1781, after the U.S. defeated the British Army in the Battle of Yorktown, ending the Revolutionary War, American industry began to grow rapidly. During the colonial period, American merchants were primarily engaged in businesses connected with Britain. Because of this, the U.S. was the first country to witness the Industrial Revolution unfolding in Britain. At the same time, Britain was also a competitor. At that time, American leaders believed that to catch up with Britain, they needed to succeed in industrialization by leveraging America's abundant natural resources. To do this, America needed to develop its own technology quickly or learn it from Britain. However, Britain strictly prohibited the export of its technologies. But where there's a will, there's a way. Bribery was the solution. Much of the technology transfer from Britain to the U.S. happened illegally. A prominent example is Samuel Slater, who is hailed as the father of the American Industrial Revolution in the U.S., but considered an industrial spy and traitor in Britain. In 1790, Slater built the first American textile mill in Rhode Island using Britain's latest machinery. By the time of his death in 1835, he was running 13 textile mills and had laid the foundation for America's cotton textile industry. Other significant advancements included Oliver Evans's invention of a flour mill and the development of steam engines, Eli Whitney's invention of the milling machine, a steel cutter, and Samuel Morse's invention of the telegraph, which was a milestone in modern communication. Many other inventors almost simultaneously began developing machinery. This was possible because America, as a nation of immigrants, actively sought to attract skilled workers. In its early days as an independent nation, the U.S. government invited a large number of skilled workers from advanced nations or ran job advertisements in European newspapers. They even sent people to Europe to learn new technologies. If you brought your country's technology to America, you could make a fortune, so people flocked to the land of opportunity. It was at this moment that the U.S. truly became known as the land of opportunity. As a result, from the time of independence in 1780 until just before the Civil War in 1860, American manufacturing grew rapidly. Starting from the cotton industry, it expanded into the railroad industry, civil engineering, steamships, steel, machinery, and more. Handcrafting was mechanized, and cottage industries turned into factories. The invention of the incandescent light bulb enabled night shifts, and factories began to operate 24 hours a day. In the 20th century, American manufacturing became the engine of the national economy, the primary source of income, the driving force of development, and the foundation of all industries. Competition among talented individuals attracted by the prospect of wealth led to rapid advancements in marketing, design, and sales on top of quality, ultimately driving the development of essential economic factors that shape the world today. In 1901, the world's largest steel company, U.S. Steel, was founded, and by 1945, Pennsylvania alone produced more steel than Germany and Japan combined. In 1913, Henry Ford invented the modern assembly line, using a conveyor belt system that had previously been used in grain mills, marking a significant milestone in the history of manufacturing. Workers were able to increase their incomes without higher education, laying the foundation for a large middle class. Parents invested in education for their children's greater wealth and prestige, but even those who weren't academically inclined could achieve middle-class status through labor, so it wasn't a major concern. American manufacturing, driven by competition, became the global leader. From cars to refrigerators to televisions, American-made products were considered top-notch. MIT professor William Bonvillian described the U.S. during World War II as the king of production. But over time, as globalization progressed, countries that posed a threat to the U.S. began to emerge. Germany and Japan were the most significant of these. After World War II, Germany and Japan focused on rapidly rebuilding their industrial bases to cope with the aftermath of the war and high unemployment rates. By focusing on innovative manufacturing systems, they began to re-emerge as manufacturing powerhouses from the 1960s. Japanese and German products became so popular in the U.S. that they posed a significant threat to American-made products. Most importantly, products from Germany and Japan were cheaper. The yen and the Deutsche Mark were undervalued. Japan, in particular, was a thorn in America's side. From the 1960s to the 1980s, Japan handled the intermediate stages of the global value chain, focusing on parts manufacturing, assembly, and production. At the same time, the U.S. focused on the initial and final stages, such as design, development, sales, and after-sales service. However, Japan began to dominate the parts, assembly, and manufacturing sectors, earning more money than the U.S. Japanese companies grew large enough to handle all stages of the process. Ironically, it was the U.S. that helped Japan achieve this. After World War II, the U.S. military government established the Marshall Plan, a European recovery program designed to rebuild war-torn Europe, restore the American economy, and contain the spread of communism by providing aid to European countries. In a similar vein, the U.S. military government believed that Japan, a victorious nation in the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars, needed to be rebuilt to prevent the spread of communism in Asia, so it provided post-war reconstruction funds to Japan. What the U.S. provided wasn't just money. To reduce the financial burden, the U.S. supported Japan with semiconductor technology to help Japan become self-sufficient. Japan already had extensive experience in chemical machinery and materials, having built up its expertise through the Meiji Restoration and the two world wars. With U.S. support, Japan began to excel in manufacturing rapidly, and by the 1980s, it had taken over the semiconductor market. During this time, a series of events, such as the Nixon shock and the oil crisis in the 1970s, accelerated the decline of American manufacturing. The Nixon shock refers to the shock caused by President Richard Nixon's announcement of measures to defend the dollar in August 1971. The most impactful measure was the unilateral termination of the gold standard, where currency could be exchanged for gold. The abrupt end of the gold standard led to a sharp rise in prices and oil costs worldwide, causing economic growth to plummet. Countries highly dependent on exports to the U.S., such as South Korea, Japan, and Latin American nations, were hit hard. The U.S. wasn't immune either. The dollar's value plummeted, leading to a threat of stagflation. The Federal Reserve narrowly averted the crisis by raising interest rates. But the high interest rate policy caused the dollar's value to soar by up to 40% against other major currencies, weakening the competitiveness of American manufacturing in the global market. American manufacturing companies, struggling under high interest rates, were driven to the brink of bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Japan's productivity continued to rise, making Japanese products 30% cheaper than American products, with equal or superior quality. One of the hardest-hit cities during this time was Detroit. As the international competitiveness of American manufacturing waned, the U.S. trade deficit surpassed $100 billion, a record high. American manufacturers, losing their livelihoods, began campaigning for protectionist measures, strongly urging the U.S. government to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. In response, President Ronald Reagan initiated the Plaza Accord on September 22, 1985, at the Plaza Hotel in New York. The countries involved were the U.S., the UK, France, West Germany, and Japan. The primary goal of the Plaza Accord was to lower the skyrocketing value of the dollar and raise the value of the yen and the Deutsche Mark to restore the price competitiveness of U.S. exports, reduce imports, and improve the trade balance. It was also intended to curb Japan and Germany's large trade surpluses. In other words, the Plaza Accord was a move to protect the U.S. economy. So Japan and Germany weren't thrilled about it, but they had no choice but to cooperate due to the direct and indirect pressure from the U.S., which hinted at the possibility of introducing protectionist measures. The Plaza Accord helped to lower the value of the dollar, improving the price competitiveness of American manufacturing products. Exports increased, and the trade deficit decreased slightly. However, this was only a short-term recovery. Globalization had already caused structural changes in manufacturing. Most notably, large companies had begun relocating their manufacturing processes to low-wage countries to reduce costs. These countries offered lower wages, tax benefits, cheaper raw materials, and looser regulations, so there was little reason not to move overseas. Naturally, companies could also enter the markets of the countries where they built factories. In short, many of America's major manufacturing companies left. This strategy of relocating production or business processes overseas to reduce costs or gain advantages in supply chain management is known as offshoring. Offshoring, which began in earnest in the 1970s, intensified in the 1990s and 2000s. Initially, countries like Taiwan, Malaysia, and South Korea were the primary targets. But after China joined the WTO in 2001, China emerged as the largest production base. China was a gold mine. The Chinese government supported it, and wages were incredibly low with virtually no regulations. Even if regulations were in place, they could easily be circumvented with a bit of bribery. During this period, Vietnam and India also began to rise. This is where another problem emerged. The fact that China opened its doors meant that products could not only enter China, but also leave China. Cheap Chinese-made goods began to flood the world, and the U.S. was the most affected. American manufacturers once again lost their price competitiveness. As a result, after peaking in 1979, U.S. manufacturing employment continued to decline, with approximately 6 million manufacturing jobs lost between 2000 and 2010. As the economy evolved and the service sector grew, the gap left by manufacturing was filled by the service industry. In fact, as of 2022, 4 out of 5 U.S. private sector workers were employed in the service economy, up from 49 million service industry workers in 1979 to 109 million today. So is American manufacturing destined to be completely overshadowed by low-wage countries like China? After all, as mentioned earlier, China has not only raised its prices, but also achieved significant improvements in product quality. As previously stated, the U.S. government is now leading the charge to revive manufacturing. Both Republicans and Democrats are calling for it, although their methods differ. Recent trends show that the U.S. is making efforts to revive manufacturing through a reshoring strategy. Reshoring is the opposite of offshoring, meaning bringing back the manufacturing or service roles of foreign or domestic subsidiaries to the home country. In simple terms, it's an attempt to bring companies' factories back to the U.S., and they are seeing some success. In 2022, manufacturing construction spending increased by 40% compared to the previous year. So why has reshoring suddenly surged? Of course, the U.S. government provided incentives and enacted policies, but the main reason is that the benefits of offshoring have diminished. Advances in automation technology have reduced the need to relocate production facilities to low-wage countries, and overseas labor costs are no longer as cheap as they once were. Global supply chain issues have also played a role. During the COVID-19 pandemic, port congestion, shipping delays, and inventory shortages caused bottlenecks throughout the global supply chain. As a result, many companies began rethinking their risk management strategies, considering supply chain diversification and domestic production expansion. After the pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, and now the Israel-Hamas conflict, the need to strengthen domestic manufacturing has become evident. In particular, the reliance on overseas sources for critical technologies like semiconductors and batteries is seen as unsustainable. At the heart of this effort is the desire to contain China. The core of the decoupling strategy is manufacturing. The U.S. believes that the outcome of the U.S.-China power struggle will be decided in advanced manufacturing. This is because key future technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum mechanics, and semiconductors are not only economically important, but also directly related to national security. Reshoring is not just about strengthening the competitiveness of American manufacturing, but also a strategy for economic security. It won't happen overnight, but if the U.S. can regain its status as a manufacturing powerhouse, we might see a resurgence of enthusiasm for American-made products. That concludes this episode on the decline of American manufacturing.